This is the lecture for Arash Abizadeh's Democratic Theory and Border Coercion, No Right to Unilaterally Control Your Own Borders. So the first point is that this article is a little long, a little complicated. It's not so bad in terms of the stuff you need to understand. I think like the meat of the article is relatively straightforward, but it can be maybe a little difficult to wade through all the different pages and understand everything that's going on. So you might find it helpful to sort of look ahead to the next reading, which is Miller kind of responding to this article. And then the next reading, which is Abizadeh responding to Miller. And then even the next reading, which is whoever that person's name is, responding to Abizadeh again, because all of these three articles, these three following this one, they all have summaries of this article pretty close to the beginning. So maybe you can read those to get like a quick summary of what this is to help you kind of structure your thoughts about it if you're having any trouble. The next thing, I think I'll actually move the boundary problem to the end of the lecture because that'll be optional, I guess. So next, to sort of understand what the article is doing, a lot of it is like he's trying to establish a certain point about the right to control borders, and specifically in order to like who has to be consulted really when it comes to deciding on border controls, on immigration controls. And his objective is to say, you know, many people think that the state or the citizens of the state get to decide on border controls. So like in a democratic state, it's the sort of citizens of the democracy who decide who to let in and who to keep out. So that's a very natural sort of idea. But his thought is that, no, actually, if you care about democratic border control, in fact, the people who should get to decide are not just the members of the state. There's no unilateral right to control your own borders, as he puts it in the subtitle of the article. So it's a sort of negative point, which is, democratically speaking, it's not just the members of the state who have a right to decide on border control. But then there's also this sort of positive part of the article, the flip side of that, which is, well, if it's not the members of the state, if it's not limited to just the citizens of the state, then who does have a right to sort of control borders? And so he talks about this in the article, but he doesn't make like a huge deal of it. So I'll just sort of illustrate the picture he's aiming to sketch before you read it, so that you have it in mind, so that maybe it makes more sense when you get to it. So the first time we see the picture described is on page 48, when he says, the upshot of the unbounded demos thesis. Oh, let's put demos. The upshot of the unbounded demos thesis is that a closed border entry policy could be democratically legitimate only if its justification is addressed to both members and non-members, or is addressed to members whose unilateral right to control entry policy itself receives a justification addressed to all. In either case, the regime of control must ultimately be justified to foreigners as well as citizens. As a consequence, a state's regime of border control could only acquire legitimacy if there were cosmopolitan democratic institutions in which borders received actual justifications addressed to both citizens and foreigners. Obviously, no such participatory institutions presently exist at the global level. At best, they exist in limited scope, for example, between states in the European Union. And then he goes on to talk about. So the thought is, in order to have democratically justified border control, it can't just be justified to the citizens of the state. It has to be justified to everybody. Basically, the justification has to be addressed to all. So either the justification is addressed to members and non-members, or it's addressed to members whose unilateral right to control entry policy itself receives a justification addressed to all. So like kind of the two options are, look, we have some sort of regime of border control in place, and either that regime is directly justified to everybody, we have some sort of global democratic process where everybody maybe gets a vote on that border regime, or the regime is controlled by the citizens of the state. But the fact that those citizens control it, that itself has been justified by everybody. So maybe everybody got to vote and everybody decided, oh, each state gets to pick its border controls or something like that. So if the idea is everybody has to have a democratic say in the border policies, either directly or indirectly in determining who gets a say when it comes to voting on border policies. And he says, look, I know there's no global democracy set up to do this right now, but that's what it would take for there to be legitimation, for there to be justification of this kind of thing, of border controls. And then the proposal resurfaces, like his sort of specific proposal resurfaces at the end of the article on 55. The question is, what is to be done? The illegitimacy of current regimes of border control makes it incumbent upon democratic polities to maintain their democratic credentials to support the formation of cosmopolitan democratic institutions of some form or another, with jurisdiction to determine or delegate entry policy. Such institutions could range from the maximally ambitious to the more modest, such as truly global political institutions, for example, federal or confederal, multilateral interstate institutions, or transnational domestic institutions. Global institutions need not, indeed on my deliberative account of democracy should not, amount to simple majoritarian voting by the world's population. He doesn't think that would work, and then he sort of discusses how it might work there. So like, what exactly does it look like? There's not like one particular way. The main focus of the article is not on what the institution should look like. It's mostly about what's required sort of in the negative sense, which is it's not enough just to justify it to the people inside the state. They're not the only ones who have a say on this. It has to be justified to everybody. So that is the sort of positive proposal in the article. The next point. So he's kind of, what he does is he sort of sets out his argument in the article, mostly. And then when you get to section, it was not numbered, but the section labeled the self-determination argument on page 49, he goes through what he takes to be sort of 5 arguments for the opposing position, 5 sort of ways to justify unilateral rights to control your own borders. And he says none of these work for various reasons. They don't justify unilateral border control. And so, this is an interesting section. It's worth looking at what he says about these different arguments and why he thinks they fail. It's perfectly like good and interesting stuff. But like in a way, the argument is sort of like in 2 parts. There's the first sort of part where he's building up his own view, his own theory, or specifically he's making a kind of argument about why democratic justification is owed to everybody. And then there's this sort of especially negative part against these 5 arguments. And they kind of, they don't stand apart from each other, but they're kind of like relatively separate in terms of argumentation. And so it's good to sort of try to get clear on the first part, which is maybe like the core of his argument. And then you can move on to his arguments against these 5. And if you have trouble with any of them, that's fine. Like, even, for instance, if you don't understand any of the stuff in this section, that won't hurt you at all understanding the earlier stuff. The earlier stuff is kind of argumentatively separate from this stuff. And this stuff kind of supports his conclusion in the first part, but it's like relatively, like it doesn't like rely on the stuff in the first part. So again, they're kind of like separate sorts of arguments. Next, there's an appendix to this article. It starts on page 57. It's labeled on coercion. And I don't know if you're tempted to skip it when you see appendix, but no, don't skip it. Very, very important. One of the most important parts of the article, because as you'll notice as we continue to read objections to this article, almost everybody ends up going, well, not almost everybody. Miller, the first objector, goes after this, and then the other guy who we're reading, he goes after this too. So this is a big point in the article. So number 1, read it. Number 2, as the reading quiz will point out, there's like some symbol stuff the reading quiz gives you the tools you need to understand the symbol stuff, but also, as the reading quiz points out, it's not like a big deal. Like if you don't understand this stuff, you can still kind of get the idea of what he's talking about just fine. It's a relatively straightforward point. He kind of like belabors it pretty deeply, and it's good that he does because it'll be good to have thought through this when we continue reading. But this is just to say, pay close attention to the appendix on coercion, both because it's important for this whole topic and just because it's an interesting topic on its own. What counts as coercion and why does coercion matter and does coercion infringe autonomy and stuff? These are all classic political philosophy questions. A few times in the article, he uses the term demos. This is a Greek word. It's talking about like the people or the population in a state, especially in a democratic state. So democracy comes from demos and cracy, so rule by the people. It's a system where the people are in charge. And so the demos is the people that rules in democracy. And so one interesting question in democracy is who is that people? Like who is a member of the demos? And so this gets us to what he calls the boundary problem in this article. So there's a pretty 45. There's a pretty extensive, I guess it starts at 44. He talked about this sort of unbounded demos thesis. There's this pretty extensive discussion of what's known as the boundary problem in political philosophy. It's not like 100% important for you to get the boundary problem stuff to understand his argument. So like starting on 45, he introduces the boundary problem, and then there's a lot of discussion of it. The really all you need for his argument to work, like all you need to understand his larger argument, is what his solution to the boundary problem is. And that comes sort of at the very bottom of 47 to the top of 48. So really, that's all you'll end up needing to understand the main argument. But it's worth getting a little clear on the boundary problem just because it's interesting on its own. This is optional, so if you want to stop watching the lecture now, you can stop watching. But basically, the thought is that the boundary problem is a tricky little problem because let's say we're Democrats. Let's say we think democracy is the only legitimate way to run a state. So what that effectively means is that whatever the state does has to be democratically legitimate. It has to be sort of justified to the people running the state or even by the people running the state. Like the people have to have a democratic say in everything the government does. And now, remember, we have this question, who is part of the people? Like who is part of the demos? And let's say we want to figure that out. Well, it's very hard to figure out how we're going to solve that question democratically, because in a democracy, you're supposed to solve these questions by sort of letting the people decide. The people vote on what should be done, or they elect representatives to decide what should be done or whatever. But then the question is, who gets to vote? Who's part of the people? You can't have a vote about who gets to vote, because in order to have a vote, you already have to know who gets to vote. So there's this sort of boundary problem in democratic theory, which is how can you democratically justify having a democracy? And if you can't democratically justify having a democracy, if there's some other way to justify democracy that's non-democratic, then the problem is why not use that non-democratic justification to justify all sorts of other stuff? So let's say there's some non-democratic answer for why these people should get to vote. Maybe they're like, I don't know, smart or something. I mean, there's no way that's going to be the answer for a democracy. A democracy, everybody gets to vote regardless of like intelligence or something. But whatever answer you have, like imagine that's the answer and it's a non-democratic one. Why not use that criterion to decide other stuff that should be done in the state? So if the idea is, oh, the smart people should get to vote because that'll lead to good consequences. Well, if something else will lead to good consequences, why not do that, even if the people don't want it? Why not just do something non-democratic? Because you already did one non-democratic thing. You decided who gets to vote. So it's really not clear how to sort of resolve this. And there's lots of proposed solutions to sort of anticipate Abizadeh's solution, his solution is, oh, the people who are part of the demos are the people who are kind of subject to its coercion. So who should get a vote in what the state does? Well, it's the people that the state is telling them what to do. If the state is coercing you, if it's telling you what to do, then you should have a vote on what it does. So, that's a sort of non-democratic solution. It's not like circular. It's not like you have to vote on who gets to vote. You just look at who is the state exercising its power over. Who is the state saying, I decide what you do? Those people, it's to them that the state owes a democratic justification. So that's Abizadeh's answer. There's other kinds of answers to the boundary problem. Some people think everybody who's like affected by the state should get a say. So the state does some stuff and this has effects on people's lives. And some people say anybody whose life is affected by what the state does should get a democratic vote. And that's different than who is subjected to the state's power, which is Abizadeh's answer. Because you might think, oh, you can be subjected to the state's power without it affecting your life very much. You might think, well, how would that work? But we actually get examples in this article because Abizadeh thinks everybody is subjected to the state's power. But of course, it doesn't affect everybody's life. Like according to Abizadeh, I'm subjected to the power of Indonesia right now, but that's not really affecting my life. So there's some people who think those with affected interests should have a vote. There's people like Abizadeh who think people who are subjected to the state should get a vote. Then there's lots of other answers to the boundary problem too. There's territorial answers. People who live in the state should get a vote. There's the no answer, which is like there is no answer. Democracy is ultimately unjustified, but what are you going to do about it? So those are some options. And if you're interested, I can give you more readings.